Hope TV is now available on GoTV channel 103, Zuku channel 873, Signet channel 817 and Star Times channel 026. Enjoy our uplifting content and family-friendly programming anytime. Hope TV, you look and live.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Like we say, it all depends from where you're watching us from. Welcome to The Leader. This is on Hope Media, courtesy of the Evangelical Alliance of Kenya. If you've been in Kenya or know anything about Kenya, you know that we've just gone through elections, and the youth, as part of that space, have been clamoring, demanding, asking, and now post-mortem is being undertaken to see whether the youth have been represented in leadership positions and what role they can play going forward. Well, the church is not left behind, and today we'll be looking at youth in church leadership. And I'm so glad that we have Bwana Ezekiel Baraza with us today.
Thank you.
Can you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Mr. Mudibo, and thank you for having me. Good morning and good afternoon, good evening, all our viewers. It's such a great pleasure to be here. My name is Ezekiel Baraza. I'm currently working as the Deputy National Director of FOCUS. FOCUS is Fellowship of Christian Unions, the umbrella body that brings together Christian unions, universities, and colleges in the country. I said currently because I'm also in transition. So beginning next year, I'll be transiting to Scripture Union to serve in the position of National Director. Thank you.
So we know people, in other words. What has been your experience? Because FOCUS in Kenya, if you can just unpack that for a moment, the FOCUS is quite a force, should I say, in terms of what it does, the experience and the engagement. Paint a picture of FOCUS in Kenya and FOCUS in Africa.
Thank you. By God's grace, as you say, FOCUS has been in existence we're actually celebrating 50 years anniversary next year. So it's really has been a journey of seeing God's faithfulness through the work among students. We were just talking the other day and recognizing that the students who are on campus when FOCUS began are in their late 70s and 80s. So that's a long story of God's impact. But currently FOCUS is present and active in 186 institutions across the country, universities and colleges, bringing together a total of 186 Christian unions. And recently we just did a survey and recognized the need to expand our ministry into the TVET institutions. And we have shortlisted or put together about 200 diploma college institutions where we are heading to, so potentially soon moving to about 400 Christian unions across the country. and over the years, we have done ministry stretching from outreach, sharing the gospel to the university and college students, discipling them to grow in their faith, building their leadership capacity, and making them, influencing them and empowering them to be catalysts of biblical social transformation in church and society. And so the last 50 years, that has been the journey, beginning with just one university in the early 70s, and now going to 186 active, anticipating 400, over 7,000 to 10,000, students varied across the years, being released into the marketplace as ethical Christian leaders, and just seeing many of our students rising to very strategic positions of influence in this country, beginning as youth and being developed at that level, and followed through and supported by the church and other players, seeing them making an influence is a great story we are proud of.
Interesting that now today's topic is all about the youth in church leadership. Do we see it as an organic result, or is it one that has been written down in law, where there is a certain quota that is allocated to the youth?
No, I don't think there is law in the first place, youth don't like laws. They want flexibility, they want dynamism. And so the more organic and the more dynamic it is, the better. And yet, in certain circumstances where that can be neglected, then intentionality around what would almost sound like affirmative action would be then necessary. But if we recognize and appreciate the demographics of our country, if we see how the role of youth has continued to take shape, then there is value in allowing youth leadership to find natural expression while being intentional to ensure that they are allocated opportunities, they are given space, and they are equipped and empowered to provide the leadership they desire to have in the church.
Kenya, as a nation, we say the bigger portion of the profile is youth.
Right.
Do we see that same representation in church in terms of leadership?
Not entirely. I wouldn't want to expressly say no, because it is expressed differently in different churches. I recognize that there are churches that are very intentional and strong on youth leadership, but also appreciate that it has been a journey. And I think for some time there was lots of concern about there being limited role of youth in church leadership. But sometimes it also depends on how people define youth in church leadership. If we think about it as primarily youth in key positions of leadership, then one would say there hasn't been commensurate or proportionate representation of youth in strategic positions of leadership. But when you think about youth in active spaces and positions of influence, they have navigated somehow in their own ways and provided very critical leadership. And one expression of that is when you think about high schools and universities in this country, they are running churches that has probably the majority of the church in the country, and they are purely led by students, 18, 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds in high schools as future persons, young 19-year-olds, 23-year-olds, 20-year-olds are leaders of 3,000 capacity churches in universities like KU. So depending on where you stand and how you look at it, one would say yes and no. Definitely there is much more that can be done to create more space for the youth. Church has been making significant progress and stride in that direction. And I think we are getting better. We can always do much more.
Just before we started the show,
yes,
we were looking at the different lenses through which we want to, look at today's topic.
Yes.
Modeling was one of them.
Right.
Then we had those positions, those modeling. Then, of course, there was the aspect of biblical social transformation. And here you're looking at the youth as catalysts.
Right.
Of course, then there is now still involved in that similar space, but now what you'd call followership, as it were. Let's take a moment and unpack those for our audiences.
Right. So the first dimension that you mentioned that we just talked about in terms of how youth can be involved in church leadership is youth being in strategic positions of influence in the church leadership structures. Definitely we have in most churches at the top, the senior most positions, either bishops or senior pastors. On very rare occasions will you find youth in those positions, but there are one or two churches where, at least I know, a church that is building up, for instance, an example in Kitale called Active Focus, a church led by one of former youth leaders called Isaiah Yugi, where he's the head of the church and he's barely 40, probably just about 36, 37. And so there are a few occasions of church youth who are in very high level scales of leadership in the church at church level in terms of positions. But structurally, thinking about church eldership, deacons, pastoral teams, to a large extent, most of the youth are in leading their fellow youth. And most of the younger pastors are youth pastors. But again, increasingly, I think For example, we are here at Hope FM, CITAM, in the recent cadre of senior pastors. I think there are quite a number of youthful senior pastors. So in terms of positions, that is, again, growing and improving. But that's one dimension where we have youth in very strategic positions of leadership and allowing them to express their potential and serve and thrive in that sense. And that would be should be considered both at the terms of board level, governance level, management level in terms of pastorate teams, volunteer level in terms of ministry leadership team level. At all levels, we need to constantly tap youth potential and place in those positions. The second dimension is what I would call Christian youth, modeling Christian leadership in different spheres of influence. Particularly, for my interest here for me is in their professions. Church leadership should stretch beyond the confines of the church community to the role of the church as an influence in society, an influence in every sphere of life. And I think Christian youth need to step up and be models of authentic, transformational, value-based servant leadership in society, in their professions, in their local communities, in their families. And in that sense, then you would see youth as a part of the church providing leadership in society as models of authentic Christian leadership. But the third dimension is youth as catalysts of biblical social transformation. Church, in my view, is the most reliable, should be at least the most reliable catalyst of biblical social transformation. And youth, being the majority, should take their positions to influence the world, to contribute into development, into the agenda for transformation of our country, into alleviation of poverty, into employment creation, and given other time, you can explore what is happening with just the entrepreneurial spirit of youth. And so we need to see Christian youth being catalysts of biblical social transformation in society as a dimension of church as providing leadership and youth as playing a leading role. But lastly, is a changing dimension, a changing paradigm in how the concept of influence is understood in leadership. For a long time, influence has been known to flow from the leader, but increasingly, influence around how leadership is done is moving from just being the domain of leaders to the domain of followers as well. In some cases, followers are influencing leaders more than leaders are influencing followers. In that sense, therefore, youth leadership can be expressed where youth influence how church leadership is done by being intentional in negotiating what is right. They understand their youth better and therefore informing and engaging the church leadership on how leadership needs to be formed and engaged, and in that sense, therefore, youth will be influencing church leadership, and thus youth will be in church leadership.
Interesting unpacking there. If we could maybe reference, as we may, examples in the Bible where leadership was not just for those who are old or experienced, so to speak.
Yes.
We have examples of kings who are barely in their teens.
Yes, yes.
And they did excellent, provided very positive leadership to their people.
Right.
What are these challenges, and can you see some cross-reference, and what would be the expectation? Or those who get in would feel that, yes, now that we're in positions of leadership, we haven't finished our work. Whose work is it? They're there really for a season, but it's not really theirs by right.
Wow. A friend of mine called Pastor George usually says that whenever God wanted to do something major, he raised a child or a youth. And it's very interesting to read through that. Think about Moses. God picked him out as a child. Think about Samson. He was a young person when he picked, his leadership role. You go through, different stories of the Bible. David, he was called as a shepherd boy out in the field. Josiah was basically a teen when he became to the position of leadership. It's interesting that Christ began to influence I mean, as overtly as stated in the scriptures, at the age of 12.
Yes.
When he's sitting with elders and they are amazed at his wisdom and judgment. And you can give many examples of how God very strategically calls young people, some from childhood and others as youth, to take up positions of leadership. One of the tensions that does exist when you think about the role youth will play and those who are already established and grown and mature in leadership in the higher positions, for that matter, is that naturally, by the time youth and children are coming into that space or into the strategic positions of leadership, they have not had as much experience, they are learning. And so I like seeing youth leaders as apprentices. And I think it is crucial that those who have been in leadership for long intentionally see youth leaders as apprentices. Those who are not just being trained, but those who are leading and learning as they lead at the same time. And that will therefore mean that the responsibilities will be shared, opportunities to provide that leadership will be made available, and intentional inclusion of young people in the positions of leadership will be essential. That will then facilitate training and mentorship, identification of talent, motivating and pushing those with potential and will be scared into spaces of exposure so that they can, express themselves, build confidence, and be utilized in the course of time in strategic roles of leadership. Of course, there is a continued argument that youth are not leaders of tomorrow. They are leaders today. But there is also an appreciation that they are not as experienced as those who have been, have spent more years, the older. So going to your question, therefore, I would say that there are many opportunities if we were intentional to place youth in strategic places of leadership. One of those that are very obvious is youth leading fellow youth. I think that has to be intentional, that has to be provided for. But two is youth voice on the platforms where decisions are made. And when we put youth in deacons board, in elders boards of churches, for intentional purposes of hearing, getting their representation and their voice in that spaces, we not only hear them, we see their potential and can confidently, therefore, place them and entrust them with greater responsibilities. So I think I would say intentionality to create opportunities, to empower, to train, to equip, after the model of God, that he picked children, he picked young people, raised them up, and for years of ministry, they made the impact. One last bit I will say about that is I've really come to appreciate the value of longevity. I have been in focus for the last 15 years on staff, and I have deep appreciation for the opportunity to have been given very strategic roles of leadership at a very young age. In mid-20s, I was leading conferences, directing conferences. And that exposed me, challenged me with gaps and failures here and there, but with lots of learning. And what that has done is that as I've stayed more in the organization, I have carried lots of experience, lots of learnings from history. And so when youth are in strategic positions of leadership, part of the value that they add is longevity. They are able to stay longer in those spaces and learn more, and perhaps be able to hand over a little earlier than those who are ahead of them because they have done it long enough to almost feel other people should take up.
I like that model where you say that longevity has its place, where one is exposed, one gets opportunity to hit, to miss, but to learn.
Sure.
And being intentional in having a pipeline mentality of, passing the baton to the next generation.
I agree.
In any case, it's all about influence, not necessarily position per se that, you hang on to it. Now, as we should be intentional in listening to the voice of the youth so that then they have their place.
Right.
Who do they listen to? I know it's a leading question in a sense because we keep hearing, you don't understand us.
Yes.
You know, we want things now.
Uh-huh.
But the now in the rush for the immediate, where does it fall in the timeline of eternity?
Interesting one. As you rightly say it, every generation is usually very significantly influenced by cultural dynamics and expressions that within the context they live in. And youth today are living in a world that is defined by moments, that is defined by instant, that is defined by speed and quick. We are thinking about 4G internet, and so they have very little patience and very little tolerance for slow and wait, and later it is, as you say, we want it now and we desire it now. Most definitely, that doesn't, life doesn't always work perfectly that way, and therefore the older, more experienced people would be genuine and actually wiser in helping young people appreciate that there's value for patience, value for process, and value for taking time to reflect, to process, and to organize things, and not just jumping into and moving and demanding and expecting that. So the question therefore comes, how do you create the connection and harmonize the people that would want to take time, process, engage, reflect, and the inexperienced youth pressured by and modeled by society around them that are, wanting things done now and instantly, and often their way, or as they say, the highway. I would think that one is that there is, as I said, youth leaders need to see themselves as apprentices. One of the greatest benefits I've gained in the recent past, especially in my 30s, is the value of mentorship. I have sat before people older than me, people who have been in strategic positions of leadership, people who have done things I would like to see them do, and I have come to value process. Maybe quite a little story around that. When I joined campus as a first-year student, I saw one young man who was very, very outstanding. He was smart in class. He was extremely prayerful. He was shining in the CU. He, in my opinion, had his life organized and well put together. And so I decided I would look for him and ask him to I wanted to be like him. So I went to his room, had a conversation with him, and told him, I really want to be like you. So he asked me, I would want you to come over on Saturday. I'll take you for a walk. And he took me for a walk of about 2 hours and gave me the story of his life. He was in 4th year, from 1st year to 4th year. I was amazed at how much he had endured, the sacrifices he had made, the pains he had gone through to become the leader and the person I was admiring. I appreciated the value of process. And so while in 4th year, another first year thought I was equally useful and good. So he came and asked me, can I be like you? And I told him, come, we'll go for a walk. And I gave him the story of my own journey as well. But what I'm suggesting there is that by and large, as younger leaders, we want to be in, to get things we want, to step into those high positions, to make that great influence. We forget that most of what these people who have achieved so much are able to achieve is not instant. It has been a journey of a walk with the Lord to get into depths of understanding Scripture, understanding the place of God. It's interesting to see that even Christ, at 12 he was engaging, but he moves into ministry at 30. And you can see Paul, being called, but even though he's mature and old, he has to spend some years away to just learn and grow. You see many other leaders like David, he's anointed as a teen, but what God takes him through before he finally ascends to the throne tells you that God values the process of growth and learning. And so the older people need to value process, the younger people need to value process, and the older people need to therefore mentor, train, equip, and exposed through apprenticeship. And the younger people needs to step into those positions boldly, but with a learning attitude and spirit, and open to be guided, to be supported, to be led. And if those two meet, then there's huge potential to harness youth in leadership, both through training them to become better leaders than those of us who are higher are, but at the same time, using them and utilizing their strength, their energy, their passion, their daring nature to do exploits for the kingdom of God.
You know what immediately just comes to mind
Yes.
was what I'd call the Titus model.
Right.
The older men teaching the younger men,
men.
the older women, younger women. And not because you know simply from age per se, as
Yes.
it were, but exposure and experience.
Experience, true.
But key to this is having that positive attitude. Because one really needs to be receptive. You need to be hungry for something to be able
yes.
to receive it and going for it. And you can see the difference it makes in the world.
True.
What happens when youth in leadership fall? Because it's the reality of life.
Yes.
We are not perfect in this world.
True.
What has been your experience, and how do you, what would you recommend as a way forward in rehabilitating? In any case, our God is one of second chances. We, while still sinners, reached out to us.
Great. As you say, I mean, failure and falling is part of life and growing. We must be intentional not to look for failure and falling. A friend of mine, I like learning from people, and one of my mentors usually tells me, experience is the best teacher, but it doesn't always have to be experience.
Learn from somebody else.
You can learn from other people's
That's right,
experience.
yes.
And so, first is to caution youth to be careful. Careful in the sense that it's interesting that when Paul is addressing young people, to a large extent, he challenges them to be careful. He talks to them about training in both in physical training, but also spiritual training. He talks to them about be careful how you walk. He talks to Timothy and tells him to flee from youthful desires. Even Songs of Solomon, the youth are told to remember their Creator, enjoy life, but be careful to remember your Creator. I think one of the very, very critical things that young people need to appreciate, even before I talk about how to engage falling, is the need to be careful. And to be careful because we are not as experienced, we're not as equipped. Young people are not as, and do not fully understand life as the older people would. And therefore, they need to engage issues with caution, with boldness, with courage, with flexibility and dynamism, but with caution and care, so that they don't easily fall. And because they are impulsive, they are energetic, they are daring, they stand higher risks of falling. And with that caution, therefore, for those of us who are in a better placed position to mentor and to watch and to work with younger people, it would be great to consider how Jesus journeys with Peter. Peter wasn't necessarily a youth, although yesterday I was reading a book where the author argues that actually the disciples were teenagers when they were called by Jesus. Someone has given a counter-argument. But when you see how Jesus walked with his disciples, and particularly with Peter, you see a gentleman who almost expresses youthful energy in Peter. Passionate, daring, wanting to try things. And a few examples. One is walking on the water. Peter is daring, like the youth will dare to do anything. And he sees Jesus, Jesus says, "Came," and he jumps into the water. But while walking in the water, he, like every young people will do, sometimes they lose focus. And then the loss of focus, they begin to sink. And what does Jesus do? He stretches his hand and reaches out for Peter to hold him first, to prevent him from falling and sinking, and then to warn him about the danger of shifting focus and lacking faith. And I think those of us who have the privilege of mentoring young people need to, one, keep our eyes on them. When we plunge young people into spaces of leadership, we need to be careful not to assume that they have it all, as I have warned them to be careful and to be learners. And therefore, that means that we have to walk by their sides. They say mentorship is show them how to do it, then, do it with them, then watch them, let them do as you watch, and then finally leave them to do it. By the time you leave them to do it, it will be a long journey. And therefore, let's walk alongside them so that should they get to a place of losing focus and sinking, we are there to quickly hold their hands. Unfortunately, most of the things that beset younger people would be things that amount to sin. They will be a result of lustful desires, passions of the flesh, and drives that they either lack control of. And what that means is that, therefore, a significant portion of what would be called falling for the young people will really be sinful in nature. And that, therefore, attracts discipline, church discipline, and processes that would even involve being removed from positions of leadership or spaces of significant influence. Those on active ministry on the pulpit will be told to step down, and many other things. So then what I will say is, just to tie that point up, is young people, be careful, watch your steps, because we have a lot of things around us to make us compromise. Mature people, let's watch our young people, keep our eye on them. Let's be close enough to hold their hands when they are sinking so that they don't collapse. And young people, again, embrace discipline. Be willing to step aside, to be helped, to be nurtured, to be restored, to grow. And older people, be kind and merciful, and to shepherd, to pastor, to restore, and to reaffirm, to embrace, to accept, so that they will feel the affection, the acceptance, and the affirmation that is needed to help them rise again when they fall. But as much as possible, let's be careful from both ends that we don't fall.
Some of the challenges that the youth would face when they are now as catalysts of biblical transformation out there.
Yes.
Because now it is out there where they are in the marketplace, so to speak.
Yes.
And of course, being held to a higher standard. What are some of these challenges that you envision?
I think one broad one is that the world out there is not necessarily going to smile and rejoice and celebrate the biblical social transformation that that Christian youth leaders would want to bring to society. Living a radical, authentic Christian life that seeks to positively transform society is living a counter-cultural life. And young people need to be ready to suffer for it. I think that the greatest challenge that Christian youth are going to face, or usually face, is the shock of the resistance they receive when they attempt to do good. And many are disillusioned and give up and align. But what is interesting is that Christ, when as a part of his last words were that in this world we will have many troubles, but he says, be of good cheer. Yes. You have overcome the world. No wonder John writes to young people and says, I write to you, young people, because you are strong, and the word of God is in you, and you have overcome the evil one. The fact that we are strong and we have God's word and we have overcome the evil one does not mean we will walk into victories, that we will step onto pulpits and everyone will lift their hands and say yes. More often than not, we will be opposed, they will be resisted, and they will be persecuted for doing what is right and for pursuing the cause of righteousness, the cause of justice, and the cause of love and good works. What then Peter writes in 2 Peter about being willing to endure suffering for righteousness' sake becomes critical. Our young people are, in my view, majority of our young people are very fragile. And I want to challenge them to build a thicker skin, because the world is not kind.
It's cruel.
It's cruel. The world is not kind to positive transformation, you move into organizations and you want to stand for integrity, you will be persecuted for integrity. People who are persecuted most in this country are not the ones who are corrupt, are not the ones who are immoral. It's those who stand. Girls who are virgin are the ones who are ridiculed in workplaces. Fight for your commitment to Christ and be willing to pay the price for transforming our society for good. And this is the beauty of it, is that even though the world would laugh, would ridicule, would persecute, they, in their quietness and reflection, are judged and condemned by our actions. Let me put it this way. I read a book on the place of a Christian in influencing society called Disciples and Citizens. And the author presents two thoughts or paradigms of Christian influence in society that I would want to share with the youth. And he uses the concept of light and salt, and he uses the terms distinctive living and subversive engagement. Distinctive living is what light does. Light shines bright and stands out in darkness. And so we have to go out there and live for righteousness and stand for truth and intentionally decide to live a life that honors God. But subversive engagement is salt that is not, you can't see it, you don't even know it exists, but you feel its impact. That we can be intentionally and quietly, without seeking approval and affirmation and praise, doing our part that creates the positive change we need. If it is in the village, if there's a child who is not going to school and you can afford some money, spare some money, make some sacrifices, pay that child's school fees. You don't have to announce it to people. You can pay as anonymous, but you will see a child educated and a family changed. That's subversive engagement, doing good works without necessarily displaying them, but people just see and recognize that something good took place. There was a positive flavor added in this life around us. And when later they ask and discover it's you, they begin to affirm your light and walk in that light. So I will encourage you to be ready for suffering. Use too much time to talk about that, but I think it's critical that young people develop a thicker skin, be ready to pay the price, and give themselves fully to provide the needed leadership in the marketplace. But the second challenge that I will mention and then quickly move on is that it takes time. To change society and to create a positive influence takes intentional investment, and it takes time. This morning I was writing a message to a group of youth professionals from my village that I work with. It's been about 5 years of trying to make positive influence in the village. We have made some strides, but we can see it's slow. We used to dream and imagine that by now our village will be totally changed. There will be no alcohol, no violence, no theft, and all that manner of things. But it's taking time, educating a child at a time, transforming. And so staying on the course and remaining resilient, steadfast, and consistent, persistent, is what young people will have to bear. It's more of a virtue they have to develop, but it's a virtue that takes energy, that takes sacrifice, that takes personal commitment to journey through it. So I would highlight those as some of the challenges they need to deal with. Maybe the last one is the reality of peer pressure. When you get into some spaces of influence, part of the reason why people are not able to contribute as much as possible is losing focus. And part of the loss of focus is contributed by peer pressure. When you are thinking about sparing a bit of your money to influence, to serve a worthy cause, when you are thinking about sparing a bit of your resources to go to take a training that will help you make better contribution, people are buying cars and houses, and they are getting married, and enjoying life. And you are waiting for the one God has ordained for you, and you haven't heard from the Lord as well. That's part of making subversive engagement positive influence, but it will not necessarily be what everyone else around you is doing and enjoying. So you will experience peer pressure to compromise, peer pressure to, enjoy life a bit more, peer pressure to, have and own what other people are owning. But we have to realize that we have our own paths that God has called us to, and we must stay the course of mission, the course of Christian influence, the cause of impact. And since this is countercultural, we must seek peer influence that is not towards us, but from us to others.
It's interesting because then, I mean, we're in this world, but should not be of this world.
Sure.
In terms of how we are affected or how we affect our influence in the world. And the church then, recognizing the potential that we have with that profile known as the youth.
Right.
Is the church embracing it? Because I'm imagining a situation like Kenya where largely we're told a greater portion of our population is youthful.
Yes.
If that is embraced, you can imagine what kind of impact and transformation it can have, not just within, but across the continent and beyond. Is the church ready?
Wow. I think sometimes questions like that demand yes or no answers are better answered by longer answers than immediate quick answers. Yes. And as you say, more than 75% of our Kenyan population is below the age of 35. East African community defines youth as from the age of 15 to 35. Kenyan, about 36%, 17 point something million of that is, of the 47 point something million of the Kenyan population is within that age bracket, what we are calling the youth, majority of them in high schools, universities and colleges, and in just starting lives in the villages and homes, and then young professionals in the marketplace. And when you think about it, 17 plus million young people is the resource we have in this country that have capacity to do so much. Is the church ready? I would say yes and no. And that sounds like playing safe. But the reason I would say yes and no again is that when you think about the church as a whole, all the church as a body of Christ together, then one would see a couple of gaps in terms of how much has been intentionally invested in leveraging and harnessing youth potential for the good of the work. Just think about investment. Analyze an average church budget and find out how much of that investment goes into intentional youth focused initiatives. And I would challenge church to do that. Just do an exercise of evaluating their budgets and asking how much are churches intentionally investing in youth, and I would add children as in view of part of what I'm headed to do. But when you think about isolated cases of people and the journey we have walked, I think it's very exciting to see models of churches that are very intentionally youth-focused. It's amazing to see, for instance, the huge churches like the Anglican Church, even the Catholic Church, and even churches like CITAM and many others. The increasing focus on youth and children across board is extremely encouraging. And therefore, we are growing into that readiness. And I don't think that this is, as you said, an organic process. We have to keep appreciating the realities and dynamics at any given time and realigning and aligning with the circumstances to be able to create those opportunities, put in place those measures, invest those resources. But part of the reason why I said no is that when you think about church and youth and leadership, there is a sense in which a huge portion of it reflects itself in youth in the church. But youth in the church are a drop in the ocean when you think about youth in the country. The number of youth who are not in church and who need to be harnessed and mobilized and reached and be brought to serve, therefore, in church leadership is massive. And I think that youth are best placed to reach youth. Unfortunately, our percentages of youth in our churches is not the highest. I do not think that I know many. Of course, there are a number of churches that will have majority of youth, but majority of churches do not have youth as the majority. In other words, they do not have the people who are best placed to reach fellow young people. And that's part of leadership, ability for youth in church to reach fellow young people. And if we have the fewer percentage of the church as youth, and yet we have the greater percentage of the population as youth, then it means we don't have capacity to reach the wider population. If you think about the youth in church, we can easily match one elder to one youth and we can say we are ready. But when we think about youth in a broader sense, then church needs to do more to equip the youth in church to reach out more, bring more youth within the church community and in the context of Christian ministry, and in that sense, reach more broadly and wider to the greater population of youth across the country.
Then what I see there is opportunity.
Yes, immense opportunity, immense opportunity. I pray that churches would see, you see the way Christ says, the harvest is plentiful, the masses are young people and children. I pray that we will have youth missions that are intentionally geared to youth. And that our young people in church, so much will be invested to equip them to reach their fellow youth. In Focus, we believe students are best placed to reach students. So we need to invest in students, universities, colleges, in the CUs to reach their fellow students. Youth in church are best placed to reach their friends in the streets, their friends in the estates. Instead of putting them with too much church programs, let church equip them and send them to those villages, to those homes, to those estates. Let them be in the sports, in the youth communities. But if they are to make influence there, then we have to equip them properly as church so that they rise to positions of leadership to influence. And so let's see every youth in church as a leader because they need to influence their fellow youth out there to make a Christian impact in the society.
And I think that's when we'll have opportunity for effective transformation because then out there, fellow youth can see, feel, and relate with them. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And of course, the receptivity is much higher out there. Yes. There.
Sure.
When you look at then the experience in Kenya vis-a-vis other environments in Africa and beyond,
right.
How do we compare? What are the likes or what is similar, what is dissimilar from your experience having been part of Focus all these years?
It is, I think one of the reasons that, and I'll use this to explain, to both state the similarities, the differences. Africa, we are so immensely privileged that our greatest strength right now may not be in money. It may not even be in our intellectual capacity in terms of how many people are well-trained and equipped to, engage at a global level. But our greatest resource is young people, something that the rest of the world, especially Europe and North America, that were originally the centers of Christianity, not originally in the last series of the Christendom, the centers of Christianity, because I know people would argue about how it began in Africa and Middle East and to the places it has gone. But just thinking about that, Africa and Asia right now, and a bit of Middle East are immensely blessed with young people, unlike Europe and North America. Africa right now, sub-Saharan Africa by and large, needs to rise up to take the leadership position as far as Christian mission is concerned. And the people who have the potential and who have the energy and who have the daring capacity and the flexibility to go out in all these places as missionaries are our young people. Think about those going for scholarships in Middle East, those going for studies in North America, those going for studies in Asia, and opportunities are opening up every now and then that our young people need to use. So I would say the difference is that we have the privilege of having many young people, but number two, we still have a very receptive group of youth to Christian faith. Many other people out there are struggling with skeptics, there is, although that is coming here, atheism is on the rise, secularism is prevalent in schools. We have an unusual great opportunity, for instance, of running PPI in high school, in primary schools. We have a leeway where we have a Christian organization, KSEF, that has government freedom to access every high school in this country and do ministry. But they are limited because of resources. So I think that we have freedoms of faith expression in this country and receptivity of the gospel among young people that doesn't exist in many other places. Most of the radical Muslims right now, in some of the spaces and are being used as terrorists, are young people. We have youth that are ready and willing to receive the gospel. We have challenges that other people are not having. We have challenges of need, livelihoods. Youth in other countries, that's not a challenge. So sometimes even preaching the gospel, you have to be at a very higher level for it to make sense. We have a message of hope to youth in our continent that are in, slums, that are in villages, that are looking and seeking for hope. And so even the challenge we see today, like the insecurity we have right now, the livelihood, economic challenges that we have, you saw how the last campaign appealed to young people just because of a message of hope. We have a better message of hope than a campaign slogan, than a campaign manifesto, that we need to take to young people and authentically model it. And therefore, that's the difference I see, that Africa has a huge youthful population that is still receptive to the gospel, and especially sub-Saharan Africa, that other parts of the continent don't have. Even Asia, they are in another faith, and so they will be more resistant to the gospel. So let's take this opportunity, marshal and leverage the chance to, impact young people and send them out as a mission force to the rest of the world to preach the gospel and transform nations.
So really the focus opportunity here, Africa, we have it.
Yes.
We have it. We have it. Paint a picture for us, if you will, for the next 5 minutes or so as we engage. Where do we see the youth in church leadership in Kenya in 5 years, 10 years down the road? Because that youth is there. The biggest resource that the youth have is, again, time. But the window is not static. It's also closing.
True.
The youth of today, the youth of now,
yes,
will not be the same youth tomorrow and the day after.
5 years ago, I saw myself as a youth. Today, I can't access youth fund. My age is past, and so as you say, the window is over. How do I see youth in the next 5 years? And I say this both as an anticipation of faith, but also some sort of prediction out of the analytics that I would see. One is that I think, like it or not, youth are increasingly being intentional, vocal, and actively engaged. And therefore, I see the next probably 5, 10, 20 years, an environment where either the church is dead or the youth the people who are youth today are appreciating and serving the younger people better, and therefore influencing the church more. Let me put it this way. We are raising, majority of the people who are now shifting from youth now are the millennials. The people who are now owning the youthful age are Generation Zs. And then the younger ones that are coming to be youth of the next generation are Generation Alphas. So we are going to see the features of Generation Zs being the major characteristics of young people. Highly connected, wanting to be global in nature, connecting across board and leading beyond the confines of a local church to the global space. And we are going to see younger people who are more engaged and have understanding of issues. But we also must be aware that we are going to deal with a more secular, more skeptic generation of youth, and therefore the dynamics of ministry and outreach and reaching to them and leading them will have to significantly change. And we have to also think about the Generation Alphas, the children right now, how they think. They think in graphics, they think in art and creatives. You cannot, or someone said, we used to say R for apple. Their apple today is not the fruit, it is the Apple gadget. So how do we then prepare for that kind of context for such young people? So let's study the trends and dynamics of Generation Zs, because they are the future younger adults. Let's see the trends and features of Generation Alphas, because they are the future youth, the current children, and prepare effectively for that generation.
What would be your parting short message in 30 seconds then to the youth in leadership?
I will tell young people in leadership, first and foremost, to seek God with all their hearts and all their energies. You do not have any other time in your life you'll have such flexibility and time to seek God. Seek God, know Him, pray, fast, read the Word, know God deeply, and follow Him more fully in your lives now. Lay the foundation for your influence in the future. But secondly, be willing to learn. Open yourselves to learn, to grow, and sit under the mentorship and leadership of other people so that you may grow. But thirdly, I will use the words of Paul to Timothy. Let no one despise you because of your youth, but be an example to them in love, in purity, in conduct, and in all other aspects of life, so that you would model true Christian leadership in your generation now and for generations to come. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much. What a wonderful place to end it. The youth, you have had it. Now is your time. Now is your time. The youth in leadership. Bwana Ezekiel,
Yes.
Thank you very much for your time. You're saying in transition, but you're not going anywhere. We'll still have you, and we'll compare notes now when you're at Scripture Union.
Thank you. Looking forward. Even in Scripture Union, there's a younger level of youth, but also I'm a Focus Associate. I'm a church member committed to youth ministry. We remain in youth work because it is the future.
Asante sana. Thank you for the privilege of your time, and indeed yours, those who've been watching. Let's do this next week, same time. This has been The Leader on Hope Media, courtesy of the Evangelical Alliance of Kenya. Stay well, stay blessed. Thank you.
This week on Testify.
Decided now everybody to go and look for somewhere to stay. Then I found myself going to our church in Deliverance Church Isili. And I became, per se, a church mouse. Starting from that time, for the next around, I was in church for around 9 months, sleeping in the church pews.
For 9 months?
Yes.
So what would you would wait for everyone else to go?
I will wait for everyone.
For them to put out the lights?
Yes, and then I come back.
Only on Hope TV. Look and live.
It's been days and Nairobi is still streaming with talent. Can the judges handle it? Nairobi youth showed up in large numbers to showcase their talent. Here comes the last part 4 of the Nairobi auditions. Tune in to The RAF this and every Saturday and repeat on Sundays at 2 p.m. and Fridays at 10 p.m. only on Hope TV. The RAF, identifying talent, inspiring passion.